IP being the kind of central tool. And that's, of course, valuable because it gives you some understanding of both the power of IP to shape creative incentives and the limitations to that power, the circumstances in which that power may be unnecessary or even occasionally counterproductive.
Cool. So give us an example in case people don't understand what that is.
Yeah. So the example that really got this started is the fashion industry. And so there, at least in the United States, you have traditionally very, very thin copyright protection bordering on like minimal.
Yeah, explain why, because that probably is counterintuitive. And I know that people listening to this are mostly quilters and sewers. And so I'm sure they'd be really interested to understand sort of why that is.
Yeah, so fashion has long been held in the United States to be a so-called useful article. So, the courts think of a $5,000 cocktail dress not as a work of art. They think of it as a thing that covers your body and is useful. Now, maybe that's a weird way of thinking about it, but that's how courts traditionally have thought about it. And useful articles are not, at least for the most part, within the domain of copyright. If they're going to be protected by IP rights, typically they're protected by patent rights. Now, in copyright, some useful articles can be protected to the extent that those useful articles contain pictorial, graphic, or sculptural features that are separable from the utilitarian aspects of the article. That test has been interpreted over time to very sharply limit the availability of copyright protection for garments. Now, this has been true for many, many decades. While this has been true and copyright protection has mostly been absent, the fashion industry has been copying like mad. So every season we see garments that are very close copies, but we see a lot more garments that are not close copies, but they're inspired by, right? So they take some design element from a popular design and they spin it out, they vary it. And these would be, if the normal rules of copyright apply, these would be infringing derivative works and they'd be illegal. But they're not because of the useful articles doctrine, and they're legal. And what do we get? We get a ton of copying, wholesale copying, and also inspired by copying. And we get a ton of growth in the fashion industry. So the fashion industry is very innovative, and it's very productive. It's growing and thriving. And Cal and I sought to try to figure out why that might be, and we came up with a couple of ideas, which I think have had some purchase over time. One is that the copying is actually productive, paradoxically, because it helps to set trends. So a lot of clothing is consumed when it becomes trendy. That's how people know what to buy. And copying helps send a signal, hey, this is a trend, which helps instruct people about what is okay to wear. Now, once the copying gets past a certain point, it starts destroying the trend because the trend appears to be too widely worn. People with a taste for fashion differentiation start jumping off the trend. Jumping onto what? Jumping onto a new trend that copying is helping to establish. And so, this is the fashion cycle. But I think what our paper suggested is that copying is at the heart of it. Copying is not the enemy of the fashion cycle. It is, in fact, at the heart of the fashion cycle. So this is an example of an industry where the logic of copyright kind of turned on its head. Interesting.
I suspect that before you go into two, that we're going to see this obviously with quilting as well. When you go to one of these shows, like there are trends and you see the trends, and that's really important as part of sort of the new buying and new trends and all of that. So that even though it's not garments, it's quilts, that we'll see that as part of the industry.
Right.
Okay. Number two, what's the other second reason?
So, related to that, if we want to talk more about fashion, there's this notion of information costs. So imagine a world where every fashion designer followed his or her own muse. And when you walked into the shopping mall, what you saw was just this kind of visual cacophony, just a welter of different designs, all kind of converging on nothing, all, just kind of following their own path. this would create a lot of uncertainty about what to wear. By anchoring designs to certain trends, copying helps reduce that uncertainty. It gives consumers a inside view of what the industry is going to produce and what the industry considers to be, suitable for wear in a particular season. That reduces information costs. Anything that reduces information costs increases consumption, all other things held equal. And so again, copying serves a really important purpose here.
Well, it's so interesting that you say it. So Quilting has this huge thing called Quilt Market, and every designer and every company comes there, and then the shops come and buy for the year. And what you're saying is literally it's visual, because they have these incredible booths where they're showing the different fabrics and the different lines. So you can walk down and see the trends. It's what you're saying about you can say, oh, well, it looks like, polka dots are a thing this year, or like, look, and it's a visualization of the. And for the shop owners, again, cuts down that information cost, because they can go and go, oh, look, there are 7 huge companies doing X. We should probably carry that in our shop. So they literally have that in their the way the industry operates for buying, which is probably true with fashion too, but it happens in Houston every year.
Yeah, and so there's a number of ways of explaining this. So Jonathan Barnett wrote a paper with co-authors which explained it in a somewhat different way, and I thought it was very helpful. It reduces risk, right? So at least in the fashion industry, and this, I'm not sure if this is true in quilting, but it's possible. There's a pretty quick cycle of innovation. There's repeated cycles of innovation. And it's very difficult to know in any particular cycle of innovation whether you're going to be a leader or whether you're going to be a follower. The ability to copy helps reduce risk, because even if you're not going to be a leader in a particular innovation cycle, you can reap some of the benefits of the innovation cycle by following a copying strategy. This doesn't reduce welfare overall. It kind of spreads it out a bit. So that's my understanding of Jonathan Barnett's take, and it always seems to me to be a pretty insightful one.
And do you think that then it's not about protecting, like, I've created this thing and no one else can do it, but that it's more of your cultural capital and subject position in terms of being a leader or being a follower, that it's like you become where you sit in the industry and everyone knows that you're a leader or you're a company that's a follower? Is that kind of what you found?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are definitely benefits to being a leader. At least occasionally. The benefits are reputational, and, those benefits can flow through to increase the value of your mark. Now, of course, trademarks play an important role, although copyright is relegated sort of to the margins. It's not entirely absent, but it's peripheral. Trademark is right in the center of things. And, firms care a lot about, unauthorized use of their mark, right, or confusing uses of similar marks. So they care about that. One of the reasons they care about it is, the brand equity that their style leadership might help create, to a certain extent, flows through into the value of that mark.
Right. Hugely. All right. So qualitative studies, and there's any other reason that we want to chat about qualitative, or we want to move on to the third one?
No, let's move on to the third. So the third is controlled experiments.
Right.
So in some ways, these are the oddest. The controlled experiment is a very old discipline, obviously, but it is not, or at least not for very long, been widely used in legal academic studies. It's starting to become more widely used now. So the idea is you've got some scholarship that attempts to simulate in the lab some innovation decision, and it attempts to measure how changes in the rules under which that innovation decision is made can lead to different performance, better or worse, on the creative task that is associated with the experiment. So let me give you an example. So a few years ago, Chris Buccafusco, Jeannie Fromer, Zach Burns, and I wrote a paper where we had subjects perform one of a variety of creative tasks. We had a creative task that was kind of mathematical creative tasks, one that was linguistic, another one that was visual. And we varied the rules under which they worked. So some of our subjects were given kind of flat compensation. So they were paid a kind of flat fee for their performance. Other of our subjects were given compensation according to something that looked kind of like copyright, which went like this. So if they did okay or better on the creative task, they were entered into a lottery to win a prize, a valuable prize. And their chance of winning the prize grew depending on how well they had done on the creative task. But pretty much anyone who did a credible job got into the lottery. So that's kind of like copyright. It's not very difficult to get a copyright. You just have to fix some minimally creative work. But your chance of actually having that copyright pay off in some market depends a lot on how good your work is. So then we sorted some subjects into a condition that, and again, this is a random assignment, some subjects into a condition that looked a bit like patent. So in the patent condition, to get into the lottery, you had to do very, very well on the creative task. It wasn't that you just could do it competently. You had to do it very, very well. And this is simulating patent in a sense because patent has much higher entry requirements than copyright. Copyright just has to have some glimmer of creativity. Patent, on the other hand, you have to have novelty. It has to be non-obvious. It has to be truly new. And so, we're simulating this difficult to get thing. But once you get it, you're in a lottery where your quality of your work helps you. So what did we find? In none of our creative tasks did the copyright incentive do, the incentive that was designed to look like copyright, did it do any work? It didn't change performance at all. And in fact, at least in one of our tasks, it seemed to depress performance compared to just a flat fee compensation. On the other hand, at least in some of our tasks, the patent structured incentives seemed to do some work. It seemed to substantially raise performance. So what did we conclude from this? Well, this is a lab experiment. So generalizing lab experiments to the real world is always hazardous. But at least in our experiment, these incentives that were structured to look more like patents seem to be more effective than the ones that were structured to look like copyright.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Super interesting. So if you were going to do a controlled experiment, what would you be? So tell me a little bit. So I get the qualitative stuff, and we're going to work with Mike to chat. So two things. I want to ask about controlled experiments. We're going to try to do a qualitative study. We're going to try to do a bunch of different studies over the years on this because I think that it's there's a lot to study with this one field. But how would you? I mean, I could sort of see how you could create a controlled experiments with guilds and other incentives to do this. I'm curious what you think we would be trying to get at I think that one of the questions that I'm curious about is when people think something is original and should be protected or squirreled away, and when they feel like they've just used common that it isn't, or that that they're okay with other people copying it or sharing it. And same with patterns that they buy. Sort of where do they see copyright influencing what they're doing, I guess, either.
Yeah. So there's two ways to think about experiments. So you can just ask people questions and get them to imagine like what people sometimes call vignette studies. So you set up like an imaginary world and you ask people to tell you what they would do in that world. So I think that vignette studies are sometimes appropriate, but I'm more interested in my own work in what experimentalists would refer to as incentive compatible studies. So I'm not really that interested, at least for my own purposes, in people telling me what they would do. I want people to actually do the thing, right? And I want them to do the thing in a way where the incentives are set up to have them behave in a way that I can predict. And then it's interesting if I set up incentives to have them behave in a predictable way and they don't behave in that predictable way, they behave in some other way, then that's really interesting.
That's really interesting.
So incentive compatible experiments are harder to do than vignette studies. And I'm not saying that vignette studies are not useful. They can be very useful. It's just, they answer certain questions and they don't answer others.
Well,
and there's
so,
always this kind of nagging question, like, well, do people